click subscribe and hit that bell notification. Second Samuel chapter 5. Alrighty, so last week we covered the anointing of King David. David has been on the run for roughly 15 to 20 years. He started out as a child, a teenager in the army, and then Saul gets jealous. He flees for his life for like 15, 20 years. He's had no home. He's dwelt in wildernesses and deserts and in foreign lands, but he's become a chief among men and gathered a mighty army around him. So for those 15, 20 years, he's had upwards of 1,200 people following him, families, soldiers, vagabonds, kind of cast outs of society. And so he became a leader of those people, finally was able to come home after Saul is killed in Gilboa. And when he comes home, he settles for 7 years and becomes king of Judah. So Judah comes and anoints him and says, we want you to be the leader over our tribe. And for 7 years, he lives in Hebron. And then Saul's children, the opposing kind of civil war Israelites, their king dies. And then they finally come over to David and said, we want you to rule over us. And so now, that was what we covered last week. David is actually commander and chief king over all the tribes of Israel. And we are going to see the establishment of his kingdom. We are going to see how God will create this enduring nation under David that was not there under Saul. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 4, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem, he reigned over Israel and Judah 33 years. Verse 6, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking, David cannot come in here. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about Jerusalem. This is a monumental shift in the history of Jerusalem. Very quickly, I just want to say in Psalm 127, verse 1, it says that if the Lord does not build the house, it will not stand. And that if God does not guard the city, then we stay up in the watch in vain. The idea is that if it is not established by God, it's not going to work. If it is established by God, it'll be very fruitful. And that's what we're going to find out. David, at this point, is invading Jerusalem that is inhabited by Amalekites, who are the Jebusites. So they are a local village clan living in that place that we call, even to this day, Jerusalem. But there's a long history in Jerusalem. It's actually been conquered before. Some names of Jerusalem, it starts out with Salem, then Jebus, Jerusalem, Zion, and the city of David. When you read in the Bible those places, it's all one place. So if you're like, oh, the people went to Jebus and they attacked it and they overcame it. Joshua actually did. And so at the time it was called Jebus. Melchizedek was king of Salem. And we know from one of the Psalms, it says that Salem, that is Zion, synonymous. And then we know that Jerusalem is also called Zion. And here we're going to find out it's called the city of David. So that transition, it started with Melchizedek as the king of peace or the king of righteousness or the king of Salem. In Abraham's day, in Genesis 16, somewhere in there. So this place was established about 1,000 years before David shows up. Then Joshua, they came up out of Egypt in Exodus, and Joshua came into the promised land and conquered this place. And he overcame it and burned it to the ground and wiped it out. And in that time, the Israelites didn't inhabit it. They actually just kind of left it alone. And then the Jebusites took over and lived there. And when they lived there, they fortified it with walls and they turned it into a fortress. And that's why when David shows up, they mock him and they say, you can't get in here. Even our blind people and our handicapped people, right? The ones who can't walk, they'll keep you out. They're mocking him. And they're talking about this fortress being impenetrable. So that's a brief history of Jerusalem. So it says that David is going to overcome this place. This is going to be his home. That's what we're going to read. And then in the long term, it's going to become God's house. It's going to become God's home. And so it will be established through David, and then the Lord will build his temple there. He will place his name there, and it will become the focal point for the rest of history. Muslims and all these people groups are fighting over Jerusalem because God has staked a claim on Jerusalem. And this is where it starts. David is going to go in and make it his home, the house of David. And then God is going to come in the next 2 chapters, and he's going to stake his claim and say, this is my house, the temple of the Lord, and you will come and offer sacrifices in this place. So this is a big shift in history that's taking place right here. They mocked David, and then in verse 7, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David, and David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. What was David's solution to overcome this fortress? How did he attack them and win? He definitely would have encamped around it. He uses a weakness of the flow of water into the city. And so he says, if anybody would overcome, you must go up the water shaft. And then he says, defeat the blind and the lame. And that's why David hates them. He took offense. I don't think we understand because we're not culturally Hebrew. We're not culturally this people group. But I really think what they insulted him with was really severe. They were talking some mad trash. And that's why it became a term that David hates the lame and the blind, just because of the language that they were using. I don't think he actually looked at a blind person and was like, I hate you. It was a derogatory remark towards him. So he sends his men up the water shaft to kill the lame and the blind, because they kind of identified themselves that way. And then it says that David overcame them and he lived in the stronghold. So David made that location his home and he took charge of it. And then he expanded it and he built it into a great city. He created a better economy. He produced a place of security and peace, and people flocked there to live near David, to shepherd their sheep and do all this different stuff. And so this is where it's going to start becoming kind of the capital of Israel at this point. So he makes it great. And then it says that David, became greater and greater. Why? Was it his ingenuity? Because he's brilliant, he's charismatic, because the Lord was with him. Just like Jesus, he grew in the stature of men and God. David was being honored by God with grace and mercy and wisdom and other people's grace, other people's wisdom, other people's mercy, and he became bigger and badder and greater. Now the God of hosts was with him. What does that mean, God of hosts? To have a host, to have an army. So he is the God of armies, and particularly the armies of Israel. The hosts of Israel is what we'll find later on. So David went from flowing water into greater heights. And in verses 11 through 12, what we find is that God honors him as this being a sign of his success. So he was given a place of rest, a place of security that he has not had for a very, very long time. And it is a qualifier to say that God is with him. So let's read that. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people. So God puts his stamp of approval on David, and he knew that because a king of Tyre, now Tyre is roughly 300 miles away, and they'd have to go over some mountains, down and through some valleys, and carry the wood and do all this different stuff. It was a very grand gesture, and it was a very honorable thing to respect another king. Israel wasn't known for having a very respectable king. Israel wasn't known for being a place of nobility with a long heritage of generations of a monarchy. You had one king before David, and who was it? It was Saul. And nobody really recognized Saul as being the king. Everybody was kind of invading the land, and Saul had to fight them back. He was not super effective. He was okay at his best, really. And so David takes the throne, and something different takes place. An outside nation recognizes him as being the king and honors him with a palace. They send the craftsmen, they send the material, and they build David a house. And it says that God honored him, and David took it to heart to know that he was meant to be the king of Israel. It begs the question. God told David 20 years ago, you will be the king. And I wonder if David really believed it over those 20 years when he was even exiled out of Israel. When God said, I will give you the entire kingdom, David lost everything. He had to put his family in an exterior nation. He took them to the Edomites, and he's like, hey, take care of my parents for me. And then he fled to the Philistines on the other side of the country. Here, I feel like David takes hold of God's promise in a unique way. I think he always relied on the promise. He always trusted that God would come through. But now he's kind of come through the tunnel. He sees the light, and not only that, but he's standing on the other side, and he's like, God has done this thing. He has. Now, why was he blessed in such a way? It says that David knew that God had made him king, but why did he make him king? What was the purpose? David knows that God's heart is for Israel. God's heart is for his promised possession. That you will be my people and I will be your God. And this is what he says. I will place a shepherd over you to protect you, to guide you, to lead you, to instruct you in my ways. And David recognizes that his role and his rise in greatness is not for himself, it's for God's people. He is blessed to be a blessing. And that's exactly what God did with Abraham. He says, Abraham, I will bless you, and through you I will bless all nations throughout time. Abraham was blessed so that we could have Christ. David is blessed so that we could have Christ. David is blessed so that the people of Israel could draw closer to God. Okay, 13 through 16. This is David's greatest weakness. He really struggles here. Verse 13, and David took more concubines, wives from Jerusalem, after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ebar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. So here we have a list of 11 boys, and what we found previously in Hebron is David had 6 boys. So at this point, he has 17 sons. That's not mentioning the girls. When they talk about genealogies, they generally speaking leave out the women. We know that he has one daughter, particularly it would be a sister to Absalom, because she gets assaulted by her half-brother, and then Absalom kills him, and there's lots of drama in the family. So when we talk about polygamy and having multiple wives and lots of children and stuff like that, what we find out in the Bible is it creates envy, it creates jealousy, it creates chaos, and it steals peace from the family. And most of the time, what we find is bloodshed. They end up trying to kill each other. So the Bible depicts polygamy culturally when it happened at that time, but the picture is actually very negative. It tells us, or it shows us by the narrative, that it's not encouraged by God. It's just a cultural fad. And in fact, in the law, it is very much discouraged, particularly for kings. It's against the king's commandment. God says you are not to take many wives. Okay, so God has built David's kingdom. He is being fortified, lots of children, new home, and all this different stuff. Verse 17, we have a great battle. Verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. So they heard, and then he heard. So he responded. So can anybody help me understand what's taking place in verse 17? So David is out doing his thing. He's out going through Israel and dealing with issues and judging between people and making decisions, and he's being a king. And the Philistines find out that David had become king of Israel. Why would they be so concerned about that? Why would they be interested? So the king became infatuated with David. The king loved David. He found no fault with him. David was out doing some stuff he knew better he shouldn't be doing. But he was wiping out whole villages and doing crazy stuff. But the king of the Philistines loved David and said, hey, I want you to go to war with us. I want you by my side when we go up to attack Israel. And David's like, yeah, okay, let's do it. He's indebted to the guy. He's living in the land. He gave him a place to live. And so they go marching up there, and David's like, I don't know what we're going to do. We're going to go fight against Saul. And he's got all his men with him. And they go marching through, and all the other Philistine leaders are like, no, wait, these Hebrews, they got to go. They're not welcome in our army. But the king loved him. So now that he's the king, they got a point to prove. These are his old pals. These are his old friends, and they don't take kindly to him switching sides. So now they come out to attack him. David hears about it, and he flees to the stronghold. Where's the stronghold? In Jerusalem. Yes. So Jerusalem being depicted as a fortress that can't be overcome. The Philistines are not getting in there. David, this is a stronghold. This has got to feel good. I mean, just after the years of being chased and feeling insecure. When they were at Ziklag, he left for the weekend and all of their wives and children got kidnapped and they burned the place to the ground. Nobody's doing that again. David's like, I'm home. These guys want to come get me, and he's running home. He's like, everybody, let's get in the fortress. This is a different tactic for David. So he goes home and he hangs out in verse 18. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. So verse 18 and 19, they came up, so David inquired. First, they heard about David, so David heard about them and responded. Then they came up, and instead of David just going out to meet them, because sometimes he had the propensity to do that, sometimes he would jump the gun a little bit, but here he immediately inquires. He goes back to the Lord and he says, God, what do I do? And I really feel like he knew he had responsibility for his men. He knew he had responsibility for their families, 1,200 people, 2,000 people. He felt the pressure of that responsibility, but now as king, he's got millions of people to worry about. And his attitude is much more needy. He is driven to the Lord more now than he is before. And so he immediately goes to the Lord, and the Lord says, go up, you will have victory. Verse 20, and David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. Therefore, the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. cutting to the quick, what happened? We didn't need to hear about the whole battle. God's like, you don't need to hear about all the what happened there. What happened? So he did it. He won, right? They came up, they went out to fight. It was great. But David's depiction shows the force behind it. It says that God has given us a breakthrough, a flood. Now, you know what floods look like. For a place that gets no rain, when we do, it floods. And you see some crazy stuff. It'll be a nice dry desert, and then all of a sudden rain will come and an entire street will be a foot deep in water just running down the hill. That's the idea, that God created a force of pressure and he punched the Philistines and pushed them back and ripped them open and gave a breakthrough. And they conquered the Philistines. In previous battles of the Philistines, it says that they were so numerous you couldn't count them. We're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So when they came up and they knew they were fighting against David, they wouldn't have just laid back and said, we'll just take half our army, we'll just take a little bit, we'll just, kind of attack David. They came out for blood, they came out for vengeance, and I guarantee they came out with a horde of people. And so David's depiction changed the name of that place. They will now call that place Baal Perazim, meaning God breaks through. God gives the deliverance. God delivers them from their enemies. Verse 21, and the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. It's kind of a weird situation. Why would David need idols? What's that all about? It was the idea that our God is better than your God. My dad's bigger than your dad. My dad can beat up your dad. It's the idea. Our God is strong, your God is weak. And so David, not so much like they did, Philistines took the ark and they put it in the temple of Dagon. Half fish, half man. Fish from the waist up, man from the waist down, right? And then it fell over. The second time it fell over, his head was gone, his hands were gone. It was a depiction of victory, that not only do we get the spoil, because gods are made out of precious things, generally speaking, but we also overcame that which you trusted in. What we believed in and what we trusted in was better than what you trusted in, what you believed in. Our God is better. Verse 22, and the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. They didn't like that beatdown, so they came back again. And when they came back again, you think David would just jump in there and be like, been there, done that, let's do it again. Come on, guys. God gave us victory last time. We should have victory this time. But that's not his approach. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up, go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded him, and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. What is the strategy this time? God tells him, don't just go up, but flank them. Go around behind them. Now, I feel like everybody would know this one, because I grew up playing paintball, and the best thing to do is like go way out of your way and sneak behind them, and then shoot them in the back. It's much easier. You don't get shot at. But at this point in war, it's like the enemy's not thinking that. It reminds me of our Revolutionary War, that we had a standard of fighting that you just, stand here and you stand here, and then we march up, and then you take turns shooting each other, and you're like, that's honorable warfare. And we're like, no, out the window with that. We're going guerrilla warfare here. We're going to win this thing. So they started hiding in bushes. They started crawling around. They started bombing them and taking out their paths of supply chains. And I feel like that's kind of the strategy changing in war at this point. They don't just face head on anymore. They're out there. They're waiting for David to show up. And then David shows up behind them in kind of this sneak approach that caught them off guard. Now, David being driven by the Lord to accomplish it, he wouldn't be so concerned if it was an honorable or dishonorable thing. He followed the command of the Lord. God told him to do it that way. Now, after he said go around the back, what did he say? Wait in the trees until what? Let's read it. It's a very good point. I want to read it one more time. So, he says, verse 24, and when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, Then rouse yourself, for the Lord has gone out before you. Who has gone out before him? So who's marching in the trees? The Lord. Now it begs the question, like, who's marching? Is it angels? It doesn't tell us, right? We don't know. But what we do know is David's job was to go around back. Okay, David, this is what you got to do. It's a very important job for you. Okay, go around back. When you get there, I need you to just wait. Just sit down. Just relax and listen. Pay attention to me. Listen for the sign that I give you. When you hear marching in the trees, and you're David, right? You're like, marching in the trees. Okay. Guys, I got a strategy. And everybody's like, what are we going to do? And he's like, we're going to go sit down and we're going to wait for the Lord. We're going to listen and we're going to wait on God. Everybody's like, well, okay, you're leading us, David, whatever you say. But it worked. David followed the commands of the Lord and he drove them out from Geba to Gezer. He followed the Lord's command and the Lord followed through and brought him great victory. The kingdom is now thoroughly delivered from Israel's greatest adversary. When Saul would fight against the Amalekites, he could put them down. When he fought against the Moabites, he put them down and they wouldn't fight back. And he could subjugate them and he could put them to cut wood and bring water. But when it came to the Philistines, they might push them out for a time, but those dudes are coming back. And David is going to find deliverance through these battles. God gave him the breakthrough. God taught him how to listen and then respond. And David finds peace. And David's response in chapter 6 is going to be bringing in the ark. He wants to honor God. He wants to respond with gratitude. And then he's going to make some mistakes when he's bringing in the ark, but he wants to do right? And then after that, in chapter 7, David's going to say something. He's going to say, I have a home. Israel's secure. We found peace, but God has no home. I want to build him a house. And that's going to start that era of prosperity. God has done a mighty miracle in David's life. And I don't know the time scale here, but we've only traveled less than a chapter of David being king, and he is finding peace very quickly. He's finding strength and security very quickly. He is established in his throne, and he is established as a kingdom and as a nation, and he is being respected by outside nations. This is a miracle God has done in David, through David, for God's people. What application do you guys take away from this text? What is it that you can apply to your life from what we've read so far? So we walk in his design. David didn't know that the place where he would make his home is the place that God would make his temple's home. He was told back in Exodus 20, pretty sure, that God would choose a city. He would choose a city to place his name, and he would dwell there. And David had no idea that it would be Jerusalem. But by walking in God's design, walking in the path that God wanted him to walk in, he inadvertently fulfilled God's desire. And that the place where his home would be is the place where God's home would be. And so there's a lot of trust in our lives that we give to the Lord, that we do our best. We make our mistakes. David, we all got our David mistakes. And we do our best to make decisions, to move in directions, to push forward. But we have to realize that we're walking in his design, that we were created as his workmanship for good works that he prepared for us. God prepared our life for us in advance, and we are learning to walk in it. And inadvertently, we are bringing glory and honor and blessing to him. And we don't have to be afraid. We're going to make mistakes. We don't have to be afraid that when we succeed and we become proud, or we fail and we become humble, that we're doing something wrong or outside the will of God. We are dedicating ourselves to the purpose and to the calling, and therefore we will fulfill his will, even when we screw up, even when we do what we know we should not be doing. He is using all of these things for good. And so we don't have to hold on to regret. We don't have to hold on to shame. We can walk into the future that God has for us because we're walking in his designs. Another one is when old friends come calling. When they come calling, they don't come to be your friend anymore. They come to be your enemy. And I found this one to be true, especially as being a Christian. When you come to Christ and you leave behind the world will come looking for you. The world will come knocking. And when they come, David's response is perfect. We inquire of the Lord, and then we defeat our enemies. Sometimes this can be a physical person, this can be a past issue coming back to haunt you, or it can be a sin of your past life, being addicted to drugs and then becoming a Christian and still struggling with it, alcohol or cigarettes or whatever it might be. When you are delivered from those things, and then when they start coming back into your life, those desires start wandering back in, you got to go back to the Lord, back to the source of deliverance, back to the breakthrough, and then defeat them once again, over and over and over again. And sometimes with physical people, it's building proper boundaries. It's reestablishing that relationship that you're not going to go the way that they want you to go, that you're not going to give in, that you're not going to back down, you're not going to relent, you're going to pursue the Lord at all cost. And if it means leaving behind some people who are a weight and a burden and a stumbling block to you, then you have to do that. Listening to the trees. What do you think I mean by that one? Being still and knowing that he is God. And this is a difficult one. It's easy to pray and be like, God, I need your help. I need wisdom. I need guidance. I need this. I need that. Praise your name. You're wonderful. You're great. And then stop and listen. This is hard. It's not in our nature as Americans to stop and to not be doing something, to not be actively listening or watching or reading or doing something. It's just to listen. And it is a discipline to wait and listen until you hear the call to battle. And then when you hear it, then you arise and you go out. And that's an art form. It is a discipline. Next week, chapter 6, we're going to be talking about zeal without knowledge and how dangerous it can be. So come on back and join us. It's going to be a really good time.